All right, so here's our dilemma.
There's no dilemma.
There's a dilemma.
Mm-mm.
I like to have an opportunity to do the intro. The last time I won the right to do the intro through our, what was it? I think I won both the rock, paper, scissors and the thumb war battle. Either way, I won the right to do the intro. She gave me falsified and incorrect information, told me the wrong episode number, and therefore it was a botched intro.
Oh, goodness.
Here we are on our way to another botched intro because she will not let me.
No, okay. Well, let me explain. There's a reason why he does not need to do the intro is because he usually does all the talking. So I figured, let me at least have the intro so that I know that I can say something in this video.
We're a minute in. Do the intro.
Good evening. Welcome to Online with OnPoint, episode 8.
Well, hello once more. Episode 8 of Online with OnPoint, our fourth and final week of On the Verge. Let me just ask you right off the top, what have you thought about this series so far?
I've loved this series, and I think it's because it's so prominent within what we do in our life and the feelings and the emotions that we come to when we're in these situations, when we're on the verge. We all experience it. We all go through it. But this is a great way to help you understand how to cope with those emotions when you're put into a situation, but coping in a way that is going to bring you closer to God. Because I think sometimes when we're caught in those emotions, it's very easy for us to turn away from God or just push Him away. Whereas this series has kind of allowed us to focus on those emotions and learn how to move forward in our walk with Jesus throughout those emotions.
Yeah, I think, part of the reality within the conversation that we've had over the last several weeks has been, one, that everyone comes to the verge, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, this is not a question of if we will have a moment of being on the verge. Mm-hmm. This is more of a question of when we get to those moments of being on the verge, then how do we respond and react? Mm-hmm. And our hope, especially this isn't just for those who are Christ followers, but especially for those of us who are kind of seeking it and maneuvering our life in that way. We know that life is hard and difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think we've learned through this experience in these last several weeks has been, if we are not prepared, we can respond poorly. Mm-hmm. And our hope is that we respond and react in a Christ-like manner, and mm-hmm. that only happens when we're connected, when we're seeking these things that are of God, and kind of those the fruits of the Spirit that we kind of talked about last week, all being outcomes of being plugged into the source and being rooted mm-hmm. in the things of God. And so, yeah, I think I've enjoyed it. So here we are, week 4 of On the Verge. What is this week? On the verge of giving.
Not giving in. That was last week.
Last week was giving in. Week before that was giving up.
Giving out.
Giving out. Yes. So we've been kind of in this journey of Israelite nation post-Exodus. Mm-hmm. So we started kind of Joshua 3, went back in some time into Numbers, looking at some of the story of Moses. Then last week we were back in the story of Joshua mm-hmm. Following the Battle of Jericho. And here, again, we advance this story. The Israelites are still on the march trying to reach the promised land. And we are actually in, and what we've asked you to read kind of in preparation for today's message has been Judges chapter 1 and the first 5 verses of Judges chapter 2. So a lot's happened mm-hmm. in the Bible since the story of where we left off last week. We are actually to a point where as the story of Judges begins, it actually ends with Joshua passing away. And so they are still on the pursuit of finding and inheriting the promised land. And Joshua has this moment upon the end of his life with the Israelites to commission them, right? He, much like Jesus had commissioned us upon his ascension into heaven, Joshua commissions the Israelites, leading them into the promised land before he's no longer with and leading the Israelite nation. And part of that commission and that command was he called them to, one, follow God, right? Follow him and obey him every step of the way, right? Knowing that there was going to be some difficult things ahead of them, that the inheritance of the promised land wasn't going to be easy. This road wasn't going to be easy. And so, but there was specific instructions of how they were to overtake the promised land, which kind of leads us into where we're at today. And hopefully you guys have found time. And if you haven't, I would love for you guys to go and read through some of the parts of Joshua and leading into Judges. But it's just a really powerful story because following that call and that commission, the Israelites actually do a pretty good job of following those commands. I mean, they stayed strong, they stayed true. They didn't, not to say they weren't perfect, but they, there wasn't kind of that the Joshua 7 chapter we talked about last week, and the sin of Achan and kind of the effects that it had within the Israelite nation that of when sin entered the Israelite nation during that time. But here we have a chunk of the story where the Israelites are progressing. They're being led by God. They're being obedient to God. They are staying strong, staying faithful. Yeah. But it can get tiring, right? And that's wherever we are within our journey in life. Yeah. Sometimes life just stretches us too thin. Sometimes life just stretches too thin. And it's like, when you take a rubber band and you pull it wide enough, it eventually gets to a point where it snaps. Judges 1 and Judges 2 here is the moment where Israel hits that point of wanting to snap.
And I think the important thing to notice, especially when you read 27 to the end of chapter 1, is God commissions them to rid the promised land.
Are you saying verse 27?
Yes,
okay,
verse
right,
27, sorry.
That's okay, just make sure.
God tells them that they need to get rid of the Canaanites within their promised land.
Yeah, I think part of the language in the tail end of Joshua was to overtake them, like overpower, overtake, kind of completely wipe out the things in which they were, or the cities and the armies that they were facing, yes.
And so I think throughout verse 27 to the end of chapter 1, it shows how they are giving out through almost a laziness of God told us to do this and we started to do it, but we didn't quite finish it. So we're just going to let them live with us. We're just going to, what's the easy way? Or we're going to make them work for us, or we're going to make them laborers within our land rather than ridding and overpowering them. They're just going to live where we are. Or they're going to work for us, or whatever that easy option was for those different tribes. That kind of seems where they were. Like, I don't want to put in any more of this effort because, like you said, I'm tired. I'm worn. I'm ready to give out. I can't do any more. And so I feel for me, when I read through verse 27 through 36, it was more of like, they're doing all these things. They're not finishing what God has commissioned them to do. So they are just being very lazy, and there's no follow through. There's no, which happens so much when you're facing situations that you're exhausted.
Yeah, I mean, well, and it's the story of humanity, right? Like, we get on these kicks of like New Year's resolutions, right? I mean, we are a product of New Year's resolutions of like, all right, January 1, I'm gonna set a point to work out and lose weight and not eat chocolate. Right? Like,
and then Girl Scout season comes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then like a month later, Valentine's Day rolls around, whatever, and then. So you set all these marks in January. Yeah. You start strong, but it doesn't take long for you to kind of trail off. And the reality here is I think this is a great image too of the call of us as Christ followers and the great commission that actually Jesus commands us into when he kind of departs from the earth is, right? It's like, go amongst all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father. But like, man, that all nations, that's a pretty big task there, Jesus. Like, but that's the reality, is like, there's a great commission. This is a great command. And it's daunting. It's challenging. It's tiring. It's difficult. The school year can be difficult, right? Like, I know this school year has definitely been different and challenging, but for the most, for the school years in which we, you kind of have in the experience of working through middle and high school, like the thought of like, man, Jesus commands us to lead all nations. Man, I can't even lead the kid that sits next to me in the cafeteria seat, or it's just because sometimes it's hard. It's hard to be a Christ follower in a school full of those who are not. It's hard to kind of stand strong and stand firm into the things that you believe and that you want to proclaim. And this was, again, God had a great call for them, knowing that there, again, you inherit this little bit of difficulty to get to the promised land, right? To a life that where you're going to inherit the beauty of what God has set aside for you. But it's going to take a little bit of work, right? It's going to take a little bit of resiliency. It's going to take some grit to get there. And this was where we find them. And the only passage and the only verse I actually really want to point out today, because I hope you guys have read this on your own, is in chapter 2, verse 2. And it literally says, "And you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars." Right? Because it's kind of recapping, that's coming off of verse 1, but recapping the commission of God. But I love how it ends with this when God addresses this. It says, "Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this?" And I want to reflect and kind of think through that question, because I think it's a very powerful question. And I think it's a question that really can relate to our previous weeks too. Like when you feel like you want to give up, why? When you feel like you want to give in to sin, like we talked about last week, why? And right now, like when we're on the edge of our rope and our structure, our system, our lives are about to snap and collapse, why have we allowed ourselves to be that? And so what I want to lead into, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is because this is where I want to spend the rest of our time really kind of dissecting and thinking through this, because part of this is, I think this is twofold. Yes, we talked a little bit about the Great Commission and the challenge of that, but beyond the Great Commission, man, life is just difficult sometimes. And I think sometimes being a Christ follower can be exhausting and definitely has its fair share of challenges along the way. But man, you don't have to be a Christ follower to encounter challenges. I mean, we're seeing it all around the world today. Like we are in a season of life that it is difficult. There's challenges. And sometimes it feels like we're on those moments of snapping and collapsing. And so as we introed into this video was this idea of how are we preparing ourselves, right? Which leads me to the big question that I want to focus on today. And this is the question: what is our foundation? What is our foundation? Because I think when we talk about giving out, like when we're on that, like I've always felt like a strong foundation won't collapse. And these moments of where we allow ourselves to collapse, or we allow ourselves to snap, when we allow ourselves to give up or to give in, it's usually a product of an improper foundation. So when we talk about that, just off the top, what are some initial thoughts as far as when God is asking the Israelites of why have you done this? To me, it feels like this is a situation of maybe their foundation wasn't as secure and stable as maybe they thought.
I think this goes back. I mean, because that goes with the question: why have you done this? It goes back on that the last week where we talked about that self-reflection. What does it look like? What am I doing? Because I know for me, when I feel like giving out, when I am so overwhelmed, when I am so exhausted, it is because my foundation isn't found in Jesus. My foundation is found in me trying to control every little situation that I know that I can't control. But I'm going to fight and try really hard to do all of these things because I want to feel like I can do it without putting God in the picture. And so I think that when I think about why have I done this, that makes me think, okay, I've done this and I'm right here right now because of these patterns and these unhealthy rhythms that have led me to giving out. And then obviously knowing that throughout that, the reason why I'm on the verge of giving out is because my foundation wasn't on Jesus. I didn't lay it all down to him. I tried to be in control of it myself.
Yeah, and I think a huge testament to this is how strong God is, right? Like, so we talk about this foundation, and there's countless stories in the scripture that talk about foundations. Jesus even has a parable, kind of like, are you building? Would you build a house on sand, or would you build a house on rock, right? Because one's stable and one's not. You build your house on sand and a poor foundation, it may stand for a few moments, a few hours, a few days, but eventually that first full rain is going to wash your home away. And that's, but the rock, that's stable. It'll withstand some winds, some waves, some rain, some things that come along our way. And I think this is the most difficult part of humanity is we oftentimes want to build our foundations on things we innately are good. They're just not God. And I think we want to build a foundation of strong relationships with other people. And so we begin to build this foundation, using you and I as an example. Like if I was to place you as the foundation, knowing that you're an imperfect individual, sooner or later, even though we love each other, even though we want to do right by each other, even though we trust each other, and we want to honor and we want to respect, in the years that we're going to be married, right? Like from the time now till we're, 92, there's probably going to be a time where you fail me in some capacity. And there's going to be a time where I will probably fail you. We're just imperfect beings. If I have my foundation set in you,
and I fail,
and you're good, right? You're God's creation. You're a beautiful being. This is like, God's creation is a good creation, but it is not meant to be the foundation of where we establish our faith, where we establish our lives. And in those moments, when we establish our faith, when we establish our foundation in those things, the moment that it fails us, the moment when it gets stretched too thin, the moment when we're faced with a little trial and with a little crisis and a little trauma, all of a sudden that foundation cracks, it splits, and it will ultimately fail.
Yeah.
And then we're stuck, or we're caught, we're falling, and then again some of that trajectory of what we talked about last week. And so, knowing that like I think this is a good principle, because again, like I said, I think this is just the struggle of humanity. Is we I've used this example before. I believe we have a God-sized hole in our heart, and oftentimes we will try to fill that hole in our heart with relationships, friends, people, substances, distractions, social media, how many likes, how many followers, how many, like all these things that we think will suffice, right? Like that we think if we have enough money, this will make me a little happy. But really the reality is we're trying to fill a hole in our heart that only God can fill. And so then the question I think becomes, if we become, again, self-awareness, right? Because what we've established last few weeks, every decision, everything we do in life is based around our self-awareness and intentionality, being intentional with what we're self-aware of. If we're self-aware that we need to build a strong foundation, to establish a strong foundation in these moments when we're on the verge of giving out, how do we be intentional of doing that? And that's where I think I want to lead as we come to a close and get ready for our small group times.
I think that the important thing to know about this topic, obviously it's different than the rest, but they all tie together. So the solutions for all of these, especially today's, all blends together. It's all going to tie into the coping skills that we want you to be focused on when you come to being on the verge, whether that's giving in, giving out, or giving up, whatever you are facing, these are all ways for you to just grow closer to God. And the number one that I know you've heard us say week after week is that you're not meant to do this alone. You're not meant to...
We can't do it. Like, if there's anything that this story specifically tells us in these Israelite nations who were following a God into the promised land, the moment that we forget that we're with God is the moment that we begin to... It's my favorite story in the Bible, right? Matthew 14, when Peter walks on the water. When we have our focus and our eyes set on Jesus, man, we can walk on water. But the very moment we start focusing on the distraction, we remove our focus from the lens of Jesus, we see the waves, we see the wind, then we begin to sink. And that's the reality. We cannot do this without God. We cannot do this without Jesus. He is the Savior. He is the Messiah. He is the strength, the foundation, the rock, the purpose, the mission behind why we live, and the reasons that we're created the way that we are. And so, yeah, you say, like, we're not, and part of it, we can't do it alone, and that's because we're created to not do it alone. So yeah, we have hit relationships quite a bit.
So like that relationship of knowing that, my foundation is on God. My relationship with Him comes first and is the strongest one that I have, but also knowing that outside of that, I have healthy people pouring into my life, speaking truth and pointing me to Jesus. Because at the end of the day, that's, as Christians and as followers of God, we want to empower and motivate each other. We want to always be pointing each other to Jesus, and because that's what God calls us to do. So not only are, obviously, the people around you should be pointing you to Jesus, because we know from experience that that's the most important relationship. And not only in that, we're pointing you to Jesus so you can grow within that relationship, but as we're doing that together, we're growing within our relationship. And so I think that's super important to know and to focus on.
I think the illustration there, to come back to this foundation piece, right? If you've seen or know of what a foundation of a house looks like, right? Like it's rebar, it's a lot of concrete, it's intertwined. If that foundation that we're building is God, right? If we try to do that ourselves and build that foundation ourselves, I don't know that it's impossible, right? Like if we're building that relationship with God, but it definitely becomes way easier to pour a foundation if there are other people beside you, right? And so, like, our foundation is to be of God, but the more that we can circle ourselves with other people who encourage us and help us build into the foundation that is of God, the stronger it will be, the faster it gets built, and then, which means, like, when we establish those things with other people, it's easier to withstand life when we're faced with trials.
And I think that leads into the next point, like knowing that we are going to face trials. Like, life isn't going to be easy. Right. It's not going to be, because I believe in God and because I know God's with me and I have that strong relationship with Him, that nothing bad is going to happen, that nothing wrong is going to happen in my life. And so I feel like remembering that and knowing what we've talked about these last couple weeks, that you're going to be faced with hard things within your life. If you haven't already been faced with very difficult things, you are going to face really hard, difficult, life-changing situations that are going to bring you to a moment of you being on the verge.
One of the words that it's part of our core values here at OnPoint is unity. And, it's even our state motto here in Kentucky, right, is united we stand, divided we fall. And I think that's especially in this coronavirus COVID-19 season, if there's one thing that we're learning, right, and I would argue all of us are learning, is the value of community. Like in isolation, we are craving relationship, we're craving communication with other people, and I believe because what this is doing is it's, I know this is again it's a trialing season. But I believe what this is doing is it's giving us a common, I don't know if we can say enemy or what, but it started to put things into perspective, right? I think it's so easy to be divided over small nitpicky things, and we as humans are great at this. We can divide over whether or not pineapple belongs on pizza, right? Like there is clear division amongst how we stand with that. But when we allow ourselves with a more common goal, like, man, we are on mission to serve Jesus. I think there's liberties and freedoms in how we maneuver our lives. We all have our opinions, but it's when we allow all those opinions and those things to divide us, that's when we become weak. It's when we can see past those and speak into the commonality of what we're fighting for that unites us. And when we are united, we are a strong people. I think that's the same when we're talking about this foundation and our movement and trajectory and becoming more like God, is that God has created unity. John 17 was Jesus' prayer for the church to be unified so that the world may know, right? Like, this is what God has spoken into existence. And when we are in relationship, when we are in community, no matter our backgrounds, no matter our strengths, our weaknesses, no matter our sin, no matter the color of our skin, no matter the family that we were raised in, the parents we were raised in, or the grandparents, or the parents we weren't raised, whatever our life story is and situation, if we are able to unite ourselves, we can be strong. And that's the reality here, I believe, is like, man, this is what's so beautiful of a community, a church community at that, like especially within our student ministry, is there's a reason we call ourselves a family, and some part of that is, man, when we're all different, we all have different lives, we all have different backgrounds, but when we can unite ourselves together, we can establish ourselves in a foundation that gives us the capacity to go out and serve the world. And so that's our call, that's our commission, that's our hope for you. What I would love is if you could close us in prayer and then kind of intro into our small group time.
And Lord, just thank you again for bringing us here together to learn more about you and to learn what it means to be on the verge, Lord. Allow us to just continue on within our relationship with you, knowing that it's okay that we come to these points, but give us the opportunity and the understanding to know that we need to make those reflections and understand and reevaluate where we are with you. I'm on the verge because of something, and it's not pointing to you, Lord. Allow us to understand that it's okay, that you're always there, but understand that we can cope with these in ways that will bring us closer to you rather than drawing us away from you. I pray that everyone who is just with us tonight understands and knows that there are leaders and people who love them and who are ready to walk alongside them throughout any situation that they are on the verge of, Lord. Whether they're on the verge of giving in, giving up, or giving out, that we are here to support them and guide them and pour into them and let them know that they are loved, and how you love them, as well as just that you're waiting for them to grow closer to you. We're just thankful for you and your son, and we pray in his name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hopefully see you in the next few moments here in small groups. Don't forget to spend some time this week looking at those reflection questions, to really dive in a little bit more deeper, more intimately within the story, challenging us to look at what do we do in life when we want to give out. And so hopefully this has been a great opportunity for us to be challenged over the last few weeks. And so we love you guys. We're thankful for you. We're here for you all. Don't forget that. And so, yeah.
Love you guys.